Well, on Finweek's cover story this week, business journalist Bruce Whitfield took a look at the 5 worst jobs here in South Africa. While it's easy to take a crack at the likes of Telkom and SAA, Bruce points out just how difficult government is making it to attract and retain good leaders in major organizations. With me in studio to discuss this, Bruce Whitfield, Craig Gibson, CEO of RightSource, and Zach Mogotsi, Tech Pro Personal. And of course, we've also got Simona Levitt joining us from Finweek. Thank you very much for joining us, y'all. So, Bruce, you start off with a comment around that 80s sign. You don't have to be crazy to work here, but if you are, it will help. And that, of course, leads you into companies like Telkom and SAA.
It's actually sorry to interrupt. It's a force of habit. Force of habit. But here you've got a situation in South Africa where to be a chief executive is an incredibly lucrative occupation. You get paid well, you're rewarded well in terms of options, you're rewarded well in terms of the cozy corner office, you get given the best car, the best parking space, maybe even you get a private toilet, which is always one of the perks of the job. But there are certain jobs in South Africa that surely no amount of money can suffice when it comes to your reputation. And there are a couple of jobs in South Africa at the moment that are death traps for professional careers. And that's how I went and identified the 5 worst jobs in South Africa. Some of it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but some of it also is deadly serious. If you consider that Telkom has had 5 chief executives in the past 7 years, not even Elizabeth Taylor, Michael Jackson's best friend, went through husbands that fast. Honestly, it is an outrageous track record of corporate failure when it comes to leadership, and it happens to be quite coincidental that 2 of the companies that we've identified happen to be owned and managed by government, SAA and Telkom. Who would really, in their right mind, want to be the chief executive of SAA or Telkom? You need your head read or need to be paid a hell of a lot of money to destroy your reputation and never work anywhere nice again. Surely, Zach?
Well, actually, not necessarily. I mean, if we look at it, we've actually got 2 problems here. For me, the first problem is in corporate. I mean, you've got a ArcelorMittal in there for various reasons. In corporate, I think you've got a lot more people who understand what they're doing, and that's shareholders, telling you what to do with the business. And in government, you've got people who probably understand business at the most elementary level, trying to tell you what to do because they're the major stakeholder. So, I mean, we're running Eskom. Man on the Street is running Eskom, SAA, and I'm surprised the SABC is not on there, actually.
Well, I'm not really sure it's a company. So I
was going to ask you who the runners-up were that didn't quite make the list. But let's talk about the government aspect, because Jabu Mabuza, who's the new chairman now of Telkom, pointing out that he's going to draw a line in the sand where government can and can't interfere.
I like Jabu Mabuza a lot. I have a lot of faith in Jabu Mabuza. He's a tough guy. He's been around the block a couple of times. He understands how the corporate world works. But I do think that people who have come from the corporate environment into the parastatal, state-owned entity environment don't necessarily understand the real sorts of pressures with which you have to deal on a daily basis. And that is the ability of a government minister who is de facto in charge because they are the controlling shareholder, saying to you, I don't think that that's an appropriate way of doing things, or I don't think we should allow KT Corporation of South Korea to come in and take a 20% stake in Telkom, provided with the capital that it needs to grow. And suddenly, when you have your wings clipped as the chairman, the chief executive, as a director of the business, you go, okay, we had a strategy, we had an agreement, we had a line in the sand, government just crossed that line all over again. That is not a sustainable way of doing this. What Jabu Mabuza is saying to government is saying, sure, you own this asset, you call the shots at this asset, so develop a policy that everybody understands, and then leave it up to us to run the business. I wish him luck with it. I really hope that this time round they listen.
Craig, what are your thoughts on the 2, SAA and Telkom, and the role that government is playing, being the key shareholder right now? And of course, the fact that we have had so many leadership changes at both of these places, and it seems that none of the leaders really are able to get it right so far.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think just the impact that government have on the leadership of these parastatals, if that's what you want to call them, is significant. If you just take the SAA hot seat as an example.
Was it more of an ejector seat?
Well, an ejector seat, yeah. You look at that job, and that business in the last 20 years has probably had the most lumpy returns that we've ever seen. Trying to satisfy just the multitude of your stakeholders, your taxpayers, and then government, it's certainly not a position that I would like to attempt to undertake. notwithstanding the fact that running an airline in today's global economy is probably one of the toughest jobs in the world today, to get that entity to turn a profit. So, I think to your point, I think there has to be some form of policy or mandate afforded to individuals that get put into these positions to run these businesses, and then let them run the asset and turn it into a commercial entity that yields a profit.
The problem here, especially let's look at SAA for example, here you've got the state which believes it needs a national carrier. It's a thing of national pride, it's a thing of apparently strategic interest, because if you don't control the routes, you can't then bring people to South Africa. And that's one of the thought processes behind the need to own a stake in SAA.
And have a loss leader is what you're referring
to. Have a loss leader, make sure that lots of tourists come to South Africa. Now, if you buy that argument, that's all well and good, and I've spoken to former SAA board members who say that that is part of the strategy, that's part of the thinking. You don't necessarily need to be making money on SAA, but then convey that as the strategy. Say, you know what, it's okay to break even. Nobody wants you to lose money, but every time SAA comes with a begging bowl and says, hi, we need a 5 billion rand guarantee, as they have recently, it becomes a little frustrating as a taxpayer. And then you've got the independent airline, it was airlines, the independent airline of Comair, which comes through and says, you see, these guys get the bailouts, we have to operate as independent entities. That's one of the reasons why One Time went down and why you can't have a competitive space. Airlines are notoriously difficult companies to run. There's just so many.
And you wonder why the One Time founders are now wanting to start another airline.
They need their heads read. They are completely nuts.
I could not believe it when I saw that.
They need something. I mean,
they have obviously got their reasons.
They have got their reasons. One, they can probably make a lot of money out of it in their personal capacities. Two, you've got to be slightly bonkers to run an airline. And I think that's one of the prerequisites. On your CV it says, slightly mad, oh, you qualify, you can run an airline. I've spoken to them about it, but they've got airlines in their blood. Talk to Chris Smythe, the former acting chief executive of SAA. He is so keen to go back and run SAA. And I've said to him, you've got to be crazy. But he says, once it gets in your blood, there is something about the airline industry that makes you want to keep doing it and doing it and doing it. Plus, if you've got a blank check behind you in the form of government, is there really that much risk to running that business? I'm not so sure. Maybe it's a great job. Maybe it's not the worst job in the world. But from a reputational perspective, where do the chief executives from these public entities go once they leave those jobs, either because they're nudged gently or because they leave of their own volition? You don't hear much of them afterwards, do you? And that's because I suspect their reputations do take a beating, and I think they're also quite punch drunk by the end of it.
You wonder, Zach, when it comes to Pinky Maholi now having resigned from Telkom, a company that she has spent a large part of her career very committed to, you wonder whether it was the KT Corporation and that the fact that government blocked that deal, whether that was really the straw that broke the camel's back, because apparently she was very in favor of it.
I think it's a variety of factors, but I mean, that was a big thing, because what then happened after the KT Corporation discussion, what then happened after that, the share price just tumbled, and it's in free fall now, So I think that was a big thing in terms of her getting out of the organization. And I think what happens with a lot of our, state-owned institutions is that they have the highest level of, potential to actually get rid of leadership capability. So a person walks out of it, and that's why Bruce never sees them again. Person walks out of their beat, reputation also not so much intact anymore. And you start to ask yourself the question, is this the kind of industry, or are these the kind of companies that can actually attract the right kind of people? And I mean, I'm in executive search, and this kind of job, we call it a sucker for punishment type of job. So
that's
when
you're talking about the heads rate.
Is that a technical term?
It is a term that we get from our clients. So when they look for someone like this, they say, we would like someone who's really a sucker for punishment. And this is the kind of job that this is. So also, the CEOs have to be accountable for it, because they took the job and they knew what was, in it as well. So we've got to balance it as well. And how do we find the balance? And that's really the difficulty.
And how do you actually attract CEOs to a job that nobody wants?
It has to be someone who wants that kind of job. So.
But how do you lure them in? Is what she's trying to say, I think.
Honestly, I'll give you an example. I spoke to a guy a few years ago, and we were talking about a job, and I explained to him what the job entailed, and he said, Zach, in my career, I've done this kind of thing, a few times before. I don't want to do it over and over again. But I'm sure out there is a guy who enjoys doing that kind of thing. And there are people who enjoy doing that kind of thing and taking on that kind of challenge. But I think in this instance, the challenge is probably maybe a bit too much because of the stakeholders.
But also in the world of professional management, where you've got people who like to rise to a challenge, we've seen some people take on some crazy jobs over the last decade or two, some really difficult jobs, some apparently insurmountable tasks. But the difference is, if you have an independent board that is either going to support you or give you the guidance and the advice that you need, you go in fully armed to go and do the best possible job you can. If you have to be second guessing what your shareholders are thinking the whole time, and they have the power to undermine you even when you are on an agreed path and an agreed strategy, that is not a fun job. And you can be the best, most qualified person in the world, and you can lose your lust for life as a result, your lust for the job as a result of being undermined by your shareholder. And I suspect in this case of these parastatals, the chief executive doesn't have the final say in this. The board doesn't have the final say. It's somebody who sits behind a desk fulfilling a political mandate.
Yeah, I think that's a massive issue. If I go back to the South African Airways scenario, if you look at when Kai was at the helm of that business, actually that organisation during his tenure there and subsequently Chris's tenure in managing that business actually turned a profit.
Yeah, they made money.
They made money. And I recall, because we were actually supplying some services at the time, some fairly strategic services that were complementing what Kai was doing in terms of turning that airline around. And I recall with the change in leadership in the government, the Bheki Zuma change in leadership, Kai actually disclosing the fact that his days were going to be very, very numbered. Now, when you look at that, and basically Chris inherited what Kai was attempting to drive as a turnaround strategy, and ultimately he knew that he wasn't going to be placed into a permanent role in that organisation for whatever reason, and it falls off a cliff. Where are we today? And I think tenure in these jobs is critical. How can you run a business for 2 years, put in a turnaround strategy, and then suddenly you get taken out of the chair? I think it's horrific.
Well, we certainly raised some interesting points. We didn't get to the other three worst jobs. Lonman's the boss chief. We didn't get to them. We don't have time for them,
but Lonman's really interesting. I'd rather be the Lonman chief executive than a rock drill operator. Let's be honest about it. You get paid a lot more and you don't run the risk of getting killed as often. But it's a horrible job as a chief executive. The platinum sector is under pressure. Your bankers want your blood. Your workers want your blood. It's a horrible job. The other bad job, ArcelorMittal, on a hiding to nothing. You've got a foreign shareholder.
And there's no vacancy there as yet.
Not yet. And then the South African entrepreneur was the fifth one on these worst jobs, because you're on a hiding to nothing there as well. Bureaucracy, just lots of really, really tough issues in the South African environment for entrepreneurs. So that rounds up the list.
There we go. Well, if you want to find out more, you can read the cover story of Finweek.